because students do need a model in class. But in the past, the model has been the CD or the recorded version, and it's recorded with one or other prestige accent from a native speaker country. Okay, the model becomes anybody, and that previous model from a traditional approach excludes virtually everybody. So it excludes Gemma, it excludes me.
Excludes me too.
All right, and so many other teachers because they don't speak as this one prestige model does.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're embarrassed and you stop teaching pronunciation, or you're permanently having to explain why you've got such a bad accent, but they allowed you to be an English teacher, and so on and so forth. Now, if you take an international intelligibility approach, the model is anybody whose own use of English for international communication has shown their pronunciation to be intelligible. And that's virtually every teacher I've met as I've trained teachers around the world. And that's very empowering. Hey, why are you going to stand up in front of your students and model English? Because you know your own pronunciation works. You've done the world, you've spoken to people in international conferences, you've been understood. So you are the living proof. And what is more, you started where your students started, and no native speaker can say that. You began exactly where they began, and you made the journey.
Yeah.
And you know you're successful. So now tell your students, hey guys, I know I'm this dummy with this weird accent, but this dummy with this weird accent made the very journey I'm asking you to do. And I've been successful. And you guys are way cleverer than me. So come with me on the journey.
This is the Teacher Talking Time podcast.
Well. Welcome to another episode of the Teacher Talking Time podcast. And today I have the immense pleasure of having here with us Robin Walker and Gemma Archer. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I wasn't sure. But I'm very happy to have both of you here on the show. It's interesting because I didn't know you guys had published a book until somebody liked a post that Rob had shared with the book. And I said, oh, wow. I remember Robin Walker from a talk he delivered about 8-9 years ago, and I had forgotten about it. And I was like, oh, these are going to be two people that I really want to talk to, especially because of the content of the book. So I think we're going to have a great conversation here. So Robin, Gemma, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah,
so I thought we could start right from the beginning, and I would like to know this. Who is Robin Walker, and why does your work matter? And Gemma, similar question, but for you is, what inspired you to pursue teaching, and where did this passion, this interest for pronunciation come from?
You should reverse the questions. I'm an accidental English teacher, like so many more, because I trained, my degree's in chemistry, and I taught chemistry in secondary education in the north of England in Newcastle. And then I met somebody who was Spanish, and she came back here to Spain to live, and she said, you should actually give up your job and come out for a year with no strings attached, because you would benefit from living in a different culture and not being a tourist. And so what was going to be a year here in Spain is now 42 years, and the benefits are immense. But what happened was, when I got out here, teachers were so desperate to get in touch with native speakers that I got hauled into teaching English. And the bit that they kept panicking about was pronunciation. I got asked, come and give us a course on English intonation. Because I was so ignorant at the time, I actually said yes. And as I was preparing the course, I realized how incredibly broad my ignorance was, and how little I knew about English pronunciation, and even less about the intonation system of English. And I began, first of all, obviously, to panic. and then to get interested. And I think the scientific bit of me is the bit that drew me to pronunciation, because it seemed that there was some science there to be followed. Yeah, I'm an accidental English teacher, but the accident's been happening for over 40 years.
For me, it's kind of similar. I'm also an accidental English teacher. I studied languages at university. I loved learning languages. My undergraduate degree was in Italian and also in English. And at that point in time, when you did a languages degree in the UK, part of your degree had to be an Erasmus year. Sadly, no longer available. Thank you, Brexit. But when I did it, that was a possibility to spend a year abroad in the country where, of the language that you were studying. So I spent a year in Milan, but before I went, someone said to me, it might be a really good idea if you got a teaching qualification before you go, because that'll give you a means of income while you're there. And it never even occurred to me to do this. And I thought, why not? And I applied for a CELTA, and I was successful and got on the course and arrived in Italy with my teaching qualification and was able to work from day one. And I just found that I really enjoyed it. I got a lot of pleasure from it. And like Robin, I had so little awareness, linguistic awareness, but awareness of English phonology. And the reason that I started to specialize in pronunciation, particularly in this part of pronunciation, was because I was a Scot. I am a Scot, but I was a Scot who had no awareness or understanding of her own accent. I did my CELTA in Glasgow, but we were taught RP phonology. We were taught standard British English. The whole class was either Scottish, and there was also one American, but we were taught RP phonology. And the pronunciation element of that course was transcribe your name using the IPA, and that was it. Then there was a big fight because people were being made to say sounds that were not part of their own vowel inventory, and that was it. And after that, I wasn't aware of how the specific differences. I just made a total fool of myself trying to teach pronunciation in those early days in Italy. And because of that, I just stopped teaching pronunciation. Well, teaching it, the brief basic pronunciation instruction I was giving. I didn't do it for 8 years. I absolutely ignored it. I was terrified that a student would ask me a question about pronunciation. So it went no further than a kind of recast. If someone said something a bit wrong or a bit unintelligible, I'd recast, I'd give them the correction. But that was it until I had to. And when I started teaching at the University of Strathclyde, one of the things I was doing was teaching electives, and I was assigned a pronunciation class, which was similarly terrifying. But over the years, I kind of found my feet a little bit, then did my diploma. And 9 years after starting teaching for the first time, someone mentioned, oh, they speak a bit different in Scotland. Let's look at that in in the most basic sense. So that was the first time ever there'd been any kind of instruction in how my voice differed from the voice in the course book and all the course books and all the training materials. And I was suddenly so incensed. I was like, but this has been such an impediment for me. My voice is different to the course book. My voice is different to all of the teachers and all of the training, all of the audio resources. And that was the beginning for me, looking into how we can overcome this as teachers. And, sure, I'm an L1 speaker of English, but I'm also one of many varieties. And I kind of relate to teachers, L2 teachers as well, who, they're faced with this difficulty of, my English isn't the same English as all of the resources out there. Where do I start? Do I have to be the same? All of these questions that, Robin and I talk about in the book. So that's where it came from in a nutshell.
A lot of very interesting insights there. I'm wondering how that American did in that class, trying to, phoneticize his name using the RP. I wonder if did he survive? Is he still teaching? What do you think?
She actually, no, I'm not sure if she's still teaching. She is in academia in the UK, but I'm not sure if she's still teaching.
Interesting. And you said something interesting there as well, Gemma, specifically about being an L1 speaker, but having a different voice. which again, I think we can all relate to. I'm an L2 speaker. My story is long. It's not the point here, but it's interesting how you said something about different voices, but a lot of the students, they hear the same voices in course books. And again, of course, this has changed because course books have changed, but the voices in course books don't sound very much like the voices of the students who are using those course books. And perhaps maybe that's one of the main reasons why I think a lot of students aimed to sound like those people in the textbooks, perhaps, which brings us to an important conversation that I really wanted to ask you both this, because Rob talked about it in the email when we exchanged a few messages about intelligibility, nativeness, certain pronunciation principles. So I would like us to maybe, especially for the audience, for people who are listening to this, a lot of language teachers listening to this, how do you differentiate intelligibility, comprehensibility, accentedness? Oh, it's a hard word
Yeah,
to pronounce.
yeah. This is the construct of Dewing and Monroe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do you differentiate those things, and what kinds of challenges do you find that these distinctions present, especially when you guys were working on this and writing the book?
Wow. Well, I mean, intelligibility is that the person listening is able to actually write down the words that were said in the construct by Dewing and Monroe. Correct me if I get this wrong, Gemma. And comprehensibility in their model was a measure of how much effort was required on behalf of the listener in order to be able to pull out what was intelligible. And accentedness is this business of how far away from what I would call a non-accent does this person's accent go?
Oh.
And the greater the distance between what I would call a neutral accent as a listener and what this person does, they're more accented. I mean, it's a disputed model. There are other people who don't enjoy the concept of comprehensibility being a very subjective measure of how much effort was required. Mm-hmm. But this is the model, and that was put forward by Dewing and Monroe, and it's one that's found. It's fairly well received throughout the ELT professionals.
So when we think about this, and I think you've mentioned in one of your talks, Robin, I don't remember exactly which one, but pronunciation wasn't a priority. It really wasn't a high priority when you started teaching, and I think it's same for you, Gemma. When we all started teaching, pronunciation really wasn't important. They always say that listening is the Cinderella skill, but I think a lot of skills could be considered the Cinderella skill. So, but eventually it became a focus. Before we jump into the book, and we're going to be going back and forth here, but what experiences or insights both of you had that led to this change in your teaching approach, moving away from this nativeness and more towards intelligibility in the classroom?
The one the turning point for me, I started to work in a university school of tourism, and I had very little contact time with my students, but their pronunciation wasn't very intelligible because they'd received no pronunciation instruction all the way through secondary. So they were left to get on with it as best they could, and some were really interested in English and therefore realized that the way they would automatically pronounce a word wasn't necessarily the way the word was pronounced. So I arrive in this place and I realize I've got to do some pronunciation work. And you look at the number of contact hours a week and you go, wow, I have so little time that I can spend on pronunciation, but I do need to spend some time because otherwise they're going to go out into the world of tourism and not be intelligible to their tourists. Right. And that's bad business. And so I started searching for priorities. I really thought I more or less sorted it out, actually. I did a lot of reading and going to lots of conferences, and I thought, yeah, I've got this one sorted out. And I published on that in a journal run by the Pronunciation Special Interest Group. It was my first publication. And then went to a talk at IATEFL in York, and watched this woman. I couldn't remember her name at the time, but she took apart everything that I'd spent the last 3 years putting together. And I go, what?
Oh.
This is crazy. Who is this woman? Never heard of her before. I mean, she comes in here, she comes to our pronunciation special interest group day, and she just tears apart everything. And I'm looking at good colleagues, and I can see they're getting upset about what she's saying. And of course, this woman was Jennifer Jenkins. And I set about the business. At first, I refused to read her articles because I thought, who is she anyway? Not even a member of the Pronsig. And then I thought, if you're going to actually put this person in their place, you better start reading what they're saying. And the more I read it, the more sense it made. And the more I realized that she was right. And it was she, with her work on the phonology of English as an international language, that made me sit and think, she's absolutely right. We've been chasing around, trying to sound like people from Oxford or from Buckingham Palace. We've been failing miserably. We've been putting our students off more attempts at pronunciation because all of their attempts fail. We've been putting lots of teachers off teaching pronunciation, as Gemma's just referred to, because what comes out of their mouths is not at all like what comes off the cassette, as we used in those days. And I go, you need to rethink everything. You need to actually take on board that your students, some might want to sound like native speakers, but most simply don't have the time. And in the world of tourism, Robin, if you're Spanish and you speak English and sound Spanish, that might be a benefit. If you walk into an Italian restaurant and all of the wait and the staff that come to the tables speak to you in Oxford English accents in the kitchen making the food, and whether it's authentic food you're going to get.
Right.
That accents have a value, and in the world of tourism, they have a huge value. And so, Robin, throw away what you've done and start picking up on where this woman, Jennifer Jenkins, has pointed in the direction that she's pointed at, and start picking up on the business of what really matters when you're teaching pronunciation in order that your students can become intelligible, even though we know they won't sound like native speakers at the end of the process. This was the big turning point for me anyway.
There's a lot of, go ahead, Gemma, sorry.
But I was just going to say that Jennifer Jenkins was really the turning point for me as well, the Lingua Franca Core. Not that I was ever teaching to a native-like goal, not consciously. I was probably overcorrecting on items that really didn't matter so much for an intelligibility perspective. But when I started to discover Jennifer Jenkins, it was just literally like, a light from the heavens descended. Suddenly I was like, this makes so much sense. Yeah, she's responsible for a lot of awakening moments, I think, with regards to intelligibility and that kind of perspective.
What's interesting is a lot of language teachers I would say in certain parts of the world are still not familiar with the work of Jennifer Jenkins. A lot of them are still pursuing this nativeness like pronunciation. And you both said something interesting, this centrality of intelligibility in pronunciation teaching. And based on my interpretation of what you said, Robin Gemma, is that this should be the priority. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about why you believe intelligibility should be prioritized over other aspects of pronunciation?
Because it's the thing that allows pronunciation to do its job. I mean, the pronunciation is it's a background system, but what it's doing is allowing you to be understood by your interlocutors when you open your mouth with whatever accent you might speak English with. I mean, what's really interesting is once you start looking at intelligibility, certain other things come up. And one of the things that comes up regularly is that native speakers, even with what would be considered standard and correct accents, prestige accents from their respective countries, native speakers frequently are not intelligible. And there are many instances, mostly at anecdotal levels, because people just don't go out and sit and do the research to get beyond anecdotal, but there are many instances of meetings where the people in the meeting are from international companies. This is all over Europe. It's happening all of the time. And then a native speaker joins the meeting and is not understood by everybody else. That the native speaker is the thorn in your side. Why is intelligibility important? Because it is the basic function. It's the one that allows communication to go on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, if you it's as simple as that. If what you pronounce is not understood, is not intelligible to the others, there is no conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the goal of communication, isn't it? I mean, your goal in communicating is to transfer information. And if information is transferred and someone understands you, does it really matter how different it is from a certain standardized model?
Right. Right. And a couple of things you said, and I want to pick one because otherwise I'm going down an endless thread of thoughts in my mind here. But both of you have moved away from teaching towards a native speaker accent like an RP or received pronunciation or general American English to focusing more on intelligibility or international intelligibility. What challenges have both of you encountered making this shift? I don't think it has been easy.
It reminds me, Robin, of Mark Hancock's excellent article in Speak Out, Pron 6 biannual journal, Dogma or Denial. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And in this article, he talks about how he feels sometimes this is kind of, spectrum of how people react to not just the intelligibility perspective, but also the Lingua Franca Core. And he says, sometimes on one end of the spectrum, people get very upset because they've spent so long trying to learn about pronunciation, like all of us. They're not taught from the beginning of their career about pronunciation. They have to spend a lot of time reading and going to, conferences and whatnot to teach themselves. And then suddenly, like Robin says, someone comes along and says, oh, but you don't have to do that. It's not necessary. And people do get a bit upset and they feel that it's kind of wasted their time and it's so different to what they have learned. So people can have quite a reaction to it.
Non-native speaker teachers that I've worked with, I mean, if they've invested a huge amount of time and effort into their own pronunciation so that they can feel comfortable with their pronunciation in the classroom, and then you come along and present the Lingua Franca Core and they say, well, what about weak forms? And you say, actually, they don't help intelligibility. They're best not used. And various other things that, they've sweated blood in order to be able to get a decent competence in. Mm-hmm. And then you come along and present the Lingua Franca Core, that it's obvious. I mean, what's really important is to help teachers to understand that one thing is what they set for themselves as models as teachers. Mm. If you're a teacher of English and a non-native speaker teacher, and you feel you're not going to be comfortable in the classroom unless you have a native speaker or near native speaker accent, and that will give you the confidence to go in the classroom and teach pronunciation, then go for it. Go for that target. Give the time over, and it's hundreds of hours that you're going to give over to it, but give those hours over because it's going to give you the self-confidence to walk into that classroom and to teach pronunciation. But the requirements of an English language teaching professional and the requirements of all of the thousands of millions of other users of English who are working, whatever, in business or they're sports people, it's a very different situation. And it's, I watch footballers now and I see them fighting with the referee in the middle of the pitch. And I'm going, they're using English. I mean, all over Europe, footballers are talking to referees in English and they're talking to each other in English. And I'm going, and I bet these guys, the minute they get away from a training session at the football field, they go off and do 6 hours of English pronunciation. No, they don't. They don't have time. And with the deepest of respect to most footballers, some of them would struggle with some of the more academic aspects. And so this is a a very simple, but for me a fairly classic example of you've got to give these people a tool that works. And if they want to open their mouths and tell the referee that that was a rubbish decision, then they need their pronunciation to be intelligible, but they don't need to even think about sounding like a native speaker. And perhaps they don't even care. Perhaps they, I've listened to motor racing drivers. They're constantly this thing that you now have where the driver and the box is connected by microphone continually. They're talking to each other continually. So we have, from my bit of Spain, there's a motor racing driver who became world champion in Formula One. And I listened to him speak English and I go, did this guy live in Oxford for 3 years? Which he did. It doesn't show in his accent because it's so incredibly Spanish, his accent.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going, but he is the living proof that when he speaks through that microphone with all of the distortion of a microphone in a motor race, when he speaks, he's clearly understood. Otherwise, he'd probably be dead by now.
Yeah.
So when we are pushing intelligibility, we are definitely not saying you shouldn't be thinking of going towards a native speaker accent. There are definitely people in this world, and a lot of non-native speaker teachers probably feel the closer I get to a native speaker accent, whichever one it is, the more confident I'm going to feel when I walk in front of the class and try to help my students with their pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd be the first people to be there to help those teachers get as close as they can and as close as they want to a native speaker accent. But there's an awful lot of other people who don't have the time or the drive or the aptitude, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree. Or the resources to actually.
Yeah. And what we're giving to those people is an approach to pronunciation that in relatively short time will make them intelligible anywhere they travel in the world, provided, of course, you have in front of you willing interlocutors, people who are listening and are willing perhaps to make adjustments to your accent, and who are not switching off, which is what a lot of native speaker listeners do, switching off the minute they hear an accent which is not their accent.
Yeah.
Going, this person's not, I can't understand this person. So this is a problem you see with the comprehensibility part of Derwing and Monroe's construct, because intelligibility can be measured. You just get them to write down what they heard, or you can do there are 3 or 4 standard ways of measuring intelligibility, but it's objective, it's measurable. Comprehensibility is purely subjective.
Right.
And we know that some people react very badly once they know the person speaking English is not a native speaker.
We're seeing a lot of this in Canada.
Yeah.
Whenever a person's open their mouth, they're like, go back to this place. You're not from here. You don't sound like. But again, I think that's also a little bit of ignorance. Some people just don't know enough to know that they don't know enough. But you've raised some very, very important points, I think, specifically from the perspective of teachers and also from the perspective of learners. Andrew, I don't know if you're going to remember this, but Donna Brinton just did a podcast with us, and she did a webinar with us too. And she said that she has worked with people who needed to speak like a native speaker because they were looking for jobs in Hollywood. So in a situation like that, it makes sense for them to sound like a native speaker. And I think what you said, Rob and Gemma, I think what you were both saying is very important. You're not saying that intelligibility is the be all or the end all be all of pronunciation, but it's offering a lot of people out there, teachers, learners included, another way of looking at pronunciation, another goal, something else to aspire for when it comes to pronunciation, right?
I published an article in a Gemma ETP is no Modern English Teacher. That's UK based, isn't it? So I published an article in Modern English Teacher 3 or 4 years ago, in which I tried to show how, in fact, international intelligibility is a point on a journey that has multiple final points, one of which could be a native speaker accent. So people who are internationally intelligible have, for example, a very good control of most consonants and we'll use one or other variant on some consonants, like the TH sounds and V. There are various options there which are intelligible around the world. People who are internationally intelligible will have their own particular set of vowels in terms of vowel quality, but will be very good at producing long or short vowels according to the actual vowel or according to the phonetic environment.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a certain other things, basically the Lingua Franca Core and one or two marginal things that you will be good at, you will be competent in if you are internationally intelligible. Will you be using weak forms? No, because they actually are damaging to international intelligibility. Will you be using coalescences? No, because they're damaging to international intelligibility.
Can you
But, sorry.
tell us what I mean, the audience needs to know.
Okay, what you want to do, where do you want to go? From what do you watch it? That's a coalescence.
Right.
And if English is being used for international communication, a lot of those coalescences, which come from rapid native speaker speech, connected speech changes, typical of native speakers, they actually are damaging to international intelligibility. So you won't.
International
Gemma,
intelligibility is such a key term as well. And I think a lot of people that misunderstand our kind of perspective when we're thinking about intelligibility or the Lingua Franca Core, a lot of people really misunderstand that we are specifically talking about L2 to L2, international speaker and international speaker. It may be a very different situation if the learner is in a country where English is the native language of most inhabitants, like the UK or the US or Canada, for instance. And I think, Robin, I don't know if it's the same for you, but that's something that I find myself explaining all the time, is that when we're talking about intelligibility, we are often focused on that L2 to L2 scenario, not necessarily the native country, like for the UK, for instance.
We are talking about ELF and we're not talking about ESL.
Okay. So that's the international intelligibility that you're speaking of.
I mean the demographics. I've God knows how many times I've gone through these demographics and now I can't remember.
It's okay.
But it's like 380 million native speakers and it's pretty stagnant, the number. And if anything, slightly falling back. And when I started researching this, we were talking about 1,500 million competent non-native speakers. But that number's rising. And the last time I saw David Graddle talk in Manchester, David Graddle reckoned very easily at this moment in time we'd be in 2,000 million competent users of English who are not native speakers. So when you go out into that world, that the L2 speaker talking to an L2 speaker is clearly the most frequent, the most common situation.
Yeah.
And then as you travel away from places like the British Isles, or you travel away from North America, and you sit down, as I was, in a hotel in Sao Paulo, and you listen to the conversation on the next table, and the second night in the hotel, and the third night in the hotel, and it's all been in English in Sao Paulo, but you've not heard a single native speaker in all 3 evenings of listening to other people's conversations. And you go, whoa, this is just, it's the more you travel, the more you realize this is what's happening. English is being used internationally between non-native speakers as a common language. It's a convenience tool. And we need to help these people because you're then helping the vast majority of learners.
Yes.
However, as I was trying to say before, when you get to this point where they are competent, they are internationally intelligible, there's absolutely nothing to stop an individual saying, okay, I know I'm internationally intelligible, but I'd really rather like to sound like a native speaker from Western Canada. You go, okay, so you need to add to what you already do these other aspects of pronunciation. You need to perfect your vowel set, and these vowels will sound like this, and that will sound like that. So you've got a lot of work to do there. You need to start using stress timing and not syllable timing.
Right.
Being internationally intelligible is not excluding the option of then going on and sounding like a native speaker. It's quite the opposite. Being internationally intelligible is a superb beginning point
Like a
to
stepping
add on
stone.
other cookies so that you sound like whichever native speaker you choose to sound like. We are not actually closing things down for people in the approach we take. We are opening things up for everybody,
Yeah.
and everybody quite quickly will reach reasonable levels of international intelligibility from which they can choose personal goals for further progress in their pronunciation.
That's very clear and very, very on point, because that usually seems to be the point of contention for a lot of people who are against the intelligibility idea. They think that it's once you're intelligible, there's no more work to be done.
No, there is so much more you can do, but then it really is a point of sitting individual students down and saying, you could stop working on pronunciation now. You will have some hiccups, but essentially your own experience will have shown you that you can be understood as you travel around the world. You are internationally intelligible. However, if you wish to go on, there are different things that you might look at as possible long-term goals. One is to sound like a native speaker. Then you'd have to choose which one to sound like, and then I can help you to travel that road. Another, which was a student of mine in my School of Tourism, she listened to the stuff that I said in class with each new group about international intelligibility and the no need, the no obligation to sound like a native speaker. And she came to tutorial and she said, I listened today and I like what you said. However, and I don't want to sound like a native speaker. And I said, okay. So she said, I just don't want to sound Spanish when I open my mouth.
Huh.
I said, that's a really interesting goal, and I can help you.
I get a lot of students giving me some interesting reasons as well about why they want to sound like a native speaker. And the most common one I hear, especially from students from like Southeast Asia, if I have a native speaker accent, when I go home, I'll get a better job. And my thought is, well, who is it that's hiring you that's going to know and be able to tell that your accent is native-like? Because, you know, that is something that's quite difficult, especially if you are also an L2 speaker. So I always, like Robin says, if that's their goal, fine, no problem. But a lot of them don't have an awareness of, sure, what it takes, but also who is going to be judging said native accent when they have it? Is it really necessary? Is that kind of idea you have in your head totally accurate?
Is this English specific? A little anecdote. I've learned Spanish pretty well.
Yep.
It's not English.
And I'm not native like whatsoever. I wouldn't even call myself fluent, but I'm okay.
You're intelligible.
Never once, and I lived in a Spanish speaking country, and that's where I learned for 4 years and onwards from there. Never once has someone said to me when interacting in Spanish, you know what, Andrew, you don't sound like a native speaker. No one's ever said that to me. Everyone's always said, oh, wow, you speak Spanish. Amazing. Let's have this conversation. So what's happening? Is that just my anecdotal experience, or is what we're talking about English specific?
No, I don't think it's English specific. People didn't say it to me in Spain at the beginning. They just got on with what I was saying. Occasionally, your pronunciation might make you say something you hadn't intended to say.
Right.
And then
Oh, I got those stories too.
and that's fine. But I don't think people. The problem with accent is that it marks you out. So coming back to something that Gemma talked about a little bit, you know, if you're teaching English to people who are going to settle in a country, there's a bit of a conflict. Because if they're young and they achieve the accent of the country they're settling in, at the same time, there seems to be the risk of divorcing themselves to from their origins and from their family. And I know studies in Eastern Canada showed this conflict in the minds of young people who were learning English and French in order to settle in, but then were feeling that they were being distanced by speaking really good English, being distanced from their origins. And it's a conflict that can be generated. And I don't think it's a conflict that will be generated exclusively if you were learning English. I think if you're learning Spanish, that might happen as well.
Yeah, they've had similar studies here with Polish children, Polish teens in particular, who've come to Scotland with their parents, and they've kind of studied the language that they pick up and then asked these children about it. And it's very similar to what you said, Robin, you know, the feeling of wanting to be included, part of the group, not on the outside, but on the other hand, some children refusing to be part of the group because of that strong feeling towards their kind of home culture, home country and language.
Very interesting. This whole accent and cultural identity, because I want to backtrack a little bit here, just so the audience is actually following my train of thought here. So, intelligibility is a goal. It's basically a goal that we should all aim for.
Yeah, because if you are internationally intelligible, you are intelligible to over 1,500 million people around the world. I don't think that's a small thing to give students.
No, absolutely not. And it's a very difficult goal to achieve. I mean, it takes time, it takes effort, but it's definitely something that is attainable.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
I think that's the important thing. And I feel that the commodification of language teaching, specifically English, has created this idea that people need. It's almost like if you don't sound like a native speaker, you're less of a person, you're less of a human being. And a lot of people, I know a lot of students who have become traumatized, have developed some sort of trauma learning a language because they felt like they had to sound a certain way. And as you said, going back to the whole accent and cultural identity, I think the question I have for both of you is how do you address this balance between helping learners improve their English pronunciation so they are internationally intelligible, while at the same time respecting their desire to maintain their L1 cultural identity?
I mean, that is the great thing about an intelligibility approach, because you can be intelligible in multiple different accents. There isn't a single accent which is the correct accent if you wish to be intelligible. And anyone who's been out in the world and seen English happening as a vehicle of international communication, that they have to surely be aware that there is no single accent which is intelligible. There is the competence in certain aspects of the pronunciation of English that make you intelligible, but you are intelligible with countless different accents.
But I think that's something that students often don't know. Yeah. They associate intelligibility in their minds with the familiar and the role of familiarity, that English that they're hearing all the time in their resources, that becomes the most intelligible because it is the most familiar. And sometimes that does need to be addressed very explicitly, that you understand, you know, general American or standard British English, you understand this easily because you hear it so frequently. It is so familiar to you. And they need that kind of, not an intervention, but they need to know, if they're not studying linguistics, they will not know that, you know, with more exposure to different accents, they will also become intelligible to them. So it's something that comes with exposure and time. Familiarity leads to intelligibility.
And you mentioned something about educating, because I feel like what happens, what I'm seeing here is competing goals. In cases where learners have these, because Rob talked about this idea of priorities for pronunciation, learners being the ones choosing what they want to sound like. So when they have these competing goals regarding accent and identity, I think the question I think a lot of teachers are probably going to be asking is, how do you guide students to make more informed decisions about their pronunciation learning, as opposed to letting media or predatory marketing campaigns that tell them like you have to sound like a native speaker? So how do you guide students to make these informed decisions about their pronunciation learning?
I mean, one of the things that's useful is to show students models that they would recognize. So here in Spain, actually, this particular motor racing driver. He was born in the region of Spain where I live. And so he's a hero here. And therefore, with adolescent boys in secondary education, and even my students in the School of Tourism, I could play them little clips of Fernando Alonso talking English and say, do you want to be successful like Fernando? How native speaker does he sound to you? And of course, he doesn't sound native speaker at all, and yet he's incredibly successful. One of the big 5 banks in Spain is the Santander, and the chief executive officer is a woman who is just on the edge of intelligibility with her English. She is massively, massively successful in life. So you can produce hundreds. You just have to look around. Obviously, the film industry, the music industries, they produce countless models that students could look up to, aspirational models, and you can get them and play them to your students, and they go, God, yeah, she sounds so Spanish when she speaks English. And you're, yeah, but she's incredibly successful. What do you want from life?
I had the same conversation. Sorry, Robin, I interrupted you.
No.
I was just going to say I had the exact same conversation, but at IATEFL last year, the IATEFL conference last year in Harrogate, and I was doing a session on tolerance, increasing tolerance, student tolerance to accent varieties. And I was giving just exactly what Robin's explained here, showing various models of very successful international people, politicians, sports stars, actors, comedians. And I've just forgotten the name, the Prime Minister from the Netherlands. What's his name again? Or former
Rutte,
yeah.
Rutte, or something like that.
Yeah, Mark something. And I mentioned him. And after the talk, 3 Dutch people came up to me at various points in the conference, and they're like, God, we always tell our students he's the worst model. Everyone laughs at him because of his accent. And I'm like, really? I'm so impressed with his English. It's to speak English to that level that you can be in the world stage and dealing with politics to that level. I mean, that's incredible. And to say that's a bad model, I find that baffling. So yeah,
I'll tell you what is for me interesting, Gemma, with all the traveling I've done with this thing about English as a lingua franca pronunciation. There are pockets, countries where you go in and you're going to get such a rough ride, because they are desperately clinging on to the native speaker, the prestige native speaker accent, the nativeness approach. The Czech Republic and Poland, they're really tough areas to go and talk about. Russia, yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Holland is another one. I was going to say. So
Brazil is one of them as well.
The idea of models is Brazil, yeah.
Brazil, yeah, Brazil is one of those, yeah.
The idea of models is so interesting because, like you said, Robin, what is, it's easy to say this is a good model, but what is someone's interpretation of a good model, right? And does that mean, Gemma, that example is great as well, the Prime Minister, I guess, of the Netherlands, and what would make a good model then? If someone says that's a bad, or that person is a bad model of what, or a good model of what? So I like the being successful model. That sounds something to shoot for to me.
And for teachers to, because students do need a model in class. But in the past, the model has been the CD or the recorded version, and it's recorded with one or other prestige accent from a native speaker country. Okay, the model becomes anybody, and that previous model from a traditional approach excludes virtually everybody. So it excludes Gemma, it excludes me.
Excludes me too.
All right, and so many other teachers, because they don't speak as this one prestige model does. And so you're embarrassed and you stop teaching pronunciation, or you're permanently having to explain why you've got such a bad accent, but they allowed you to be an English teacher, and so on and so forth. If you take an international intelligibility approach, the model is anybody whose own use of English for international communication has shown their pronunciation to be intelligible. And that's virtually every teacher I've met as I've trained teachers around the world. And that's very empowering. Hey, why are you going to stand up in front of your students and model English? Because you know that your own pronunciation works. You've done the world. You've spoken to people in international conferences. You've been understood. So you are the living proof. And what is more, you started where your students started, and no native speaker can say that. You began exactly where they began, and you made the journey.
Yeah.
And you know you're successful. So
I think
now
that's such
tell
an
your
important.
students,
Yeah.
hey guys, I know I'm this dummy with this weird accent, but this dummy with this weird accent made the very journey I'm asking you to do. And I've been successful. And you guys are way cleverer than me. So come with me on the journey.
Yeah.
Love it. And on the other side of that, I'm sure we've all heard this as teachers. Like, hey, Andrew, I understand you great. And then when I go outside, I don't understand anything. You know, they get used to the same voice again and
All the
again,
time.
all the time, right? Which is a disservice in the broader sense, because as you say, they need different, everyone speaks differently. They need different models. And they're just listening to me or just listening to you. That's not doing the job either.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Absolutely.
it's what's really interesting is to get students, because they have different aspirations, but to get students to actually choose somebody who speaks English in a way that they feel is how they would like to speak English. And to get them to bring in a little video clip where they do their own analysis of, I like the way that this person does this sound. I like the way that this person deals with this aspect of pronunciation. I'm going to try and imitate that. In other words, what you're doing is encouraging. I mean, clearly as a teacher, you have to guide this and do all of the setting up and the logistics, but you're encouraging your students to go out there and find somebody who speaks English and is clearly intelligible,
Yeah.
and that they would like to do the same, and then to begin to clone that person, which is a long way from doing repetition exercises on the difference between hat and hut.
Yes.
With technology these days, you could probably actually clone that person. You could probably just do it.
Yeah, you can create like an avatar of that person and just becomes your conversation buddy. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Masatoshi Sato, and he was on the podcast a couple of years ago. And he talked about this very same thing where he would, I think he was working with motivation, but one of the things within the realm of motivation was to find a non-native speaker model for Chilean students. And I remember a lot of them chose this very famous and very successful entrepreneur in Chile who speaks intelligible English, has an accent, what have you. And that was the goal for those students, is to try to emulate or to try to sound more like someone who has a very similar background to them. So there is this common ground for them. And the second thing I was going to add is also, I just remember there's Jane Setter, Seta. Yeah. She was on the podcast too. And I remember her saying something interesting. She said, a good model, and this is going back to what you said, Rob, a good model is somebody who has clearly spoken English in a variety of communicative settings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be a native speaker. There are people who can speak English very clearly in very different communicative settings, and they can be a native speaker, or they can be a non-native speaker. And again, I remember one of my best friends is from Ireland. And I remember having a conversation with him the first time we met, and I just could not understand a word this man said. And I was like, dude, I am sorry, but I don't understand you. So it doesn't, in
I love
a lot
that
of people have
analogy.
that problem. What is it,
I love
Gemma?
that analogy. It cancels out, sorry, I'm interrupting you. I love that analogy because it cancels out so many native speakers. I mean, we all know native speakers that could not make themselves understood in an international environment.
Right.
I certainly know. And I think that's just such a great way of looking at it. If you can make yourself clear and understand and be understood, no matter where you are, who you're talking to, that's extreme skill.
Which brings me to the question now. How has this shift in emphasis from a native-like pronunciation to intelligibility, how do you think this has affected the learner's confidence and motivation in learning a language? What has been your experience with that like so far?
Something that Robin always says, and I think we've put this in the book as well. Robin says, if you work on these sounds from the Lingua Franca Core that we know will increase intelligibility, and he says it's so matter of fact, if you work on these sounds, you will improve your intelligibility, your international intelligibility. It's that simple. And I think that's such a powerful message. If you do this, it's very likely you're going to improve. People will understand you far more easily. They will understand you the first time. And I think it's very liberating for many students who have this kind of idea of what they should be working towards. And when you tell them actually, and you show them the models, you introduce near peer role models like you were talking about there, I think it can be very liberating. At least certainly that's my experience. And, you know, I work in academia, I'm working with international postgraduates all the time. And when you remind them, you know, look at our university, it's something like 50, in certain departments, you know, it's 50% international staff and students. You know, we have to be, you know, intelligible for everyone because of our environment, but also outside it. So certainly I've noticed a lot of positive reactions when they come to realize this, but at first there's often a bit of shock and a bit of disbelief. I don't know if that's the same for you, Robin.
Disbelief, you got me on thinking about, my students said to me that they really appreciated my concern for their pronunciation. I mean, I loved the job I had teaching English in the School of Tourism, and I got on really well with the students and staff. And they said to me, yeah, you know, you're right. The problem is, Robin, and you've got to forgive us here. The problem is there are no marks for pronunciation. So we've got a little oral that we do at the end of the year, and we've got the usual stuff with the reading comprehension and the essay that you ask us to write and the listening. But there are no marks during the year or at the end of the year for pronunciation. And I thought, yeah. And, you know, the little bit of the effort they make to get through the 3-year course and the commitment and the time they spend in hotels and all that. And I'm asking them to also worry about their pronunciation, and there's no payback on it. So I checked out the university regulations, and there was nothing to stop me actually getting my students to record them speaking English and for me to award a mark. And it was amazing, the impact. Students just totally switched on to pronunciation. And the thing that I was laughing about that you made me think about, Gemma, was the day I handed, the students would give me the recording, which was in a reel-to-reel cassette then. There's no digital stuff at the time. And they would give me the script with their name on, and I would mark incorrect pronunciation onto their script and then give them a final mark for what I'd listened to. So I gave this piece of paper and the cassette back to a student and walked on to the next student and was giving another piece of paper back. And the student who just received her work said, "Robin, you've given me somebody else's." And I turned around and saw her name on the top, and I said, "No, it's yours." She said, "It can't be mine. It's got an 8 out of 10. And I said, "That's because you pronounced everything correctly. I showed you 2 things or blah, blah, blah." And she said, I got 8 out of 10. And I said, "Yeah." She said, I never get more than 4. And I said, "I'm sorry, this is pronunciation. You got 8 out of 10. I'll take the mark away if you want." She said, no, I'll have that mark. And it went like that. You see that students started to find out, Jesus, this is really interesting. I mean, we get marks for this. And I said, is this carried through to the end of the year, Robin? And I said, yeah, it's in my book. It's in my file, you know. It's part of your year mark. It's 20% of the year mark is your pronunciation. Their pronunciation shot up in quality. And then they came and they said, we've come to tell you, we feel a bit guilty because we've finished, the 3rd year's over and we've got our diploma, but you should know we cheat on the pronunciation work. And I go, oh, really? And they said, well, we get together, 3 or 4 of us who, you know, we trust each other. And the one who's not speaking is listened to by the others who tell that's okay or that's not okay, you should try again. And I said, oh, really? So you get feedback from each other? Yeah. And the other thing is, when you get it, we've had about 7 or 8 attempts before we think it's good enough. And I go, this is really terrible. What more do you want from your students? It was so incredible. They never collaborated on essays. Reading is like the ultimate on your own experience, you know. Yeah. And then suddenly I give them these recordings to do, and they're getting into groups, they're giving each other feedback, they're checking on the internet. By then they had internet, and then they're handing in what is the result of 7 or 8 attempts, which is called repetition. But you can't do it in class because it's stunningly boring.
Mm-hmm.
It certainly changed a lot the minute that was the biggest change, was when we started giving them marks for their pronunciation. It's very simple to do,
especially for those who maybe might not have cared about it. I find as well, students that have had real trauma, had really embarrassing or humiliating moments because of pronunciation, communication breakdowns, they are motivated, but they are few and far between compared to these students who, when you start to give them marks, they're suddenly more motivated to participate and listen to one another, for sure.
And you have both talked about, I think it was Robin who wrote about this, working on elements that are, I think the word, I'm trying to see if I remember it right, damaging to intelligibility. And I think weak sounds is one of them.
Yeah, weak forms.
I think, weak forms. Intelligibility is more, so working on these elements that are damaging to intelligibility is more productive than trying to eliminate an accent.
Let's get this right. There are certain,
Can you give us examples of these elements? And I think it's important for people to know what they are.
Well, these are aspects of native speaker speech that have occupied huge amounts of space with pronunciation exercises in course books.
Right.
The things you would need to be able to do if you wanted to sound like a native speaker. So it is, for example, the use of weak forms. We would never say at, we say it. We would never say of, we say these, because they eliminate elements which might be grammatical elements in the construction of a phrase, because they suppress them completely in order to get more quickly to the next stressed syllable. Mm-hmm. Well, they can make you quite difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And so what we feel is native speakers will do this, and many native speakers will not be conscious that they're doing this. And the other one I mentioned earlier was this thing about coalescence with what you want to do, where do you want to go.
Right.
Native speakers will use these, and there's nothing you can do about that. So you need receptive competence. You need to be able to hear English spoken at normal speed by native speakers who are using all of these things like weak forms and reduced vowels. It's not again, it's again. Mm-hmm. You need to be able to listen to that and understand it. Otherwise, there will be people who will speak to you and you won't understand them comfortably. But as it's a thing that makes you hard to understand, don't incorporate that into your own pronunciation. So we have a set of productive skills and we have a set of receptive skills, and they are not identical. Whereas a traditional approach is what you could do, you could understand. They were absolutely identical.
So
it's that beautiful place where pronunciation and listening meet. And where we can take those features from a pronunciation section of a lesson into a listening section of a lesson, and it's a means of comprehension, understanding, rather than producing them.
Okay, what are some of the examples of the productive elements and the receptive elements? So weak forms, it's important to understand that. Linking sounds.
Receptive skill,
Connected speech, vowel reduction, assimilation, that kind of thing would all be receptively learned. And I think sometimes that can be the meeting in the middle for those people who really think it's important to teach these things. We're not saying no, never teach them. We're saying sure, teach them, but teach them from the perspective of listening and understanding rather than producing.
It's interesting what Mark Hancock, coming back to Mark again. We mentioned Mark.
We're going to have to get him on the show too.
We all know each other. Yeah, you do need to get Mark on the show. We all know each other and we're always having conversations about this. But Mark the other day was interesting with something he put forward, that in order to pick something up, perhaps you could do, like, for example, picking up weak forms. Perhaps you could do some lessons where students attempt to produce weak forms, even though it's not a long-term goal.
Right.
And so by attempting to produce them, you become more sensitive to them. And when you hear them in the mouths of native speakers, then you pick up on them more easily.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Marnie Reid also talked about that at the Accents conference in Wood a couple of years ago. There's always this kind of discussion, do you teach perception before production or vice versa? And, there's always kind of debate about, which should happen first. And something that she said in her own experience was when she was living in Japan or traveling in Japan, and she had prepared to hear, she was on the metro, on the underground train, she prepared to hear a certain stop, the pronunciation of a certain stop, but she didn't hear it when it was announced, and she missed her stop. And when she mentioned this to her students, they then taught her how to pronounce it, and she said it was only when she was taught to pronounce it that suddenly she could hear it. So I think that's quite a nice analogy as well, that sometimes it can be perceptual then production, sometimes they both help one another, and sometimes it's not necessarily the which one is first, but they're both helpful.
There's definitely you definitely need to have some sort of awareness, and that could be a receptive awareness or a productive awareness. But as Robin said, you don't really need to produce that. I don't think it's I don't know if it's a goal for us to actually have our students connect their speech when they communicate. But if we show them that this is what people do when they're communicating, then you're kind of building that awareness. Yeah.
Sensitivity to it.
Yeah.
One area which gets also huge coverage in course books, and most of what's there should actually be dumped, is intonation in terms of falls, rises, and rise falls. Most of it's wrong. And now I'm talking about books that have only just come out, where there's this one-to-one relationship. If it's a WH question, it's a fall. If it's a polar question, it's a rise. This is total rubbish.
I would invite them to talk to a Valley girl, Robin. I would invite them to talk to a Valley girl and tell me if there's rising and falling there. Or my kids, my teenage kids here, who just are always their intonation is always rising. Yeah. So they talk to me. I always think it's a question, but it's not a question. I'm like, why do you guys talk like this? They're like, Dad, this is how we talk.
Yeah.
So,
that was, I think it was Barbara Bradford who first spotted that and called it upspeak.
Oh.
And it was really common down in the London area amongst young people in the London area.
Oh, really?
But it usually, those things have come from North America, actually.
It's definitely back, I think. It's definitely back. I definitely hear it.
It's an age thing.
It's an age thing, right? It's interesting.
Coming back to intonation, intonation is given, it's one of the shibboleths. Are you a native speaker? And you get native speaker listeners saying, the intonation is so bossy. Yeah, but if you actually sit down in an international setting where the most people are not native speakers, you don't get that sort of comment coming up.
Right.
And the impact of intonation on your intelligibility is absolutely minimal. And the impact of teachers doing exercises on intonation in the classroom is also minimal in terms of the student's competence.
I'm glad you said that, because the studies that I have read show that there's very little uptake in terms of pronunciation instruction in the classroom. Which brings me back to a question, because I think both of you have talked about this, measuring intelligibility. Yeah. Could you elaborate on the methods you use to objectively, because I know people are going to be asking this, how can you objectively measure intelligibility in your students? And how can you use these assessments to guide your teaching in the classroom?
If you can listen and write it down, the person has been intelligible. So a dictation type activity is one way of doing it. If your students in a classroom come from different backgrounds, for example, so you might have a Turkish L1 student paired up with, I don't know, a Japanese L1 student. And if they can dictate to each other and write down successfully what the other person has said, then they're being intelligible to each other. Another is close, where you listen to a person speaking and you've got the text, but there's gaps. And if you can fill in the gaps just by listening once, that person's been intelligible. It's not as complete. And you can ask true, false type questions. So these are the things, at least that I picked up from reading around the work of Dowing and Monroe, that researchers into applied linguistics use as the tests. And they're the simplest is can you write down what the person has said? And that doesn't require preparation, so it's easy to use in the classroom. Whereas if you go down the pathway of close or true false, then you have to prepare some questions, or you have to prepare a closed grid.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Even the act of setting them off to do a typical, B2, C1 level problem-solving task. If they solve the task, they've clearly been intelligible to each other. It doesn't require any more testing. And
it's so powerful as well, that type of activity. It's so powerful because they see immediately when someone hasn't understood them. It's such a great activity for demonstrating international intelligibility. They get that immediate feedback either through facial expressions or requests for repetition. But they get it when they do this activity. It's so powerful.
And what's also powerful about the activity is, because of what Gemma says, that you see from your interlocutors' faces that you've not been intelligible. It forces you to look at your pronunciation and have another go. And there are examples from Jenny's data, from her field data, of her watching students in London doing these pair work tasks that are so typical of B2 and C1 level exams. And suddenly discovering no one's understood them, and doing a little rethink. What do I normally pronounce wrongly? And then pronouncing it again in a different way, and seeing the faces light up again. And this is wonderful, because this negotiation of meaning, or this accommodating the way you speak to make yourself more intelligible, is another of the skills that's required that was not required previously, because we'd all be speaking with one accent and we'd all be perfect in that one accent. But the world doesn't speak English with one accent. And therefore your accent might be perfectly fine in Europe, and you've been around Europe doing your job and your accent's done great. And you fly out to Southeast Asia and you suddenly go, oh boy, I thought I spoke really, really clear English, but I need to do some modifications here because these guys don't understand me. And we can do that in class, which is what Gemma was describing. It's very powerful. However, you can't do it in classes in the context that I work in, because my students all have Spanish as their first language. So when they find that they're not understanding each other in English, they modify their English back towards Spanish until it's so Spanish that they may as well be speaking Spanish.
Spanglish.
And I remember watching this happen in front of my very eyes, and they were doing pair work about giving directions. So one student whose pronunciation was pretty good said, "Go down the road." And the other student said, "Okay, go down the road." "The qué?" "The road." "Ah, the road. Sí, yeah, go down the road." Well, road would not work outside that classroom. So what's interesting here is that these communication activities are totally brilliant for teaching pronunciation if we have mixed L1 backgrounds working with each other. And they're very detrimental to pronunciation if everyone shares the same L1 background. That's something that's not being really picked up on in English language teaching. We went so big in the 80s. We went so big on these communication activities. But in many, many places around the world, the victim of the communication activity was the student's pronunciation, which went deeper and deeper and deeper back towards the mother tongue pronunciation.
Right. No, Gemma, go ahead.
Robin, you once talked about this very issue, and you mentioned, and again, we know that AI is far from perfect, certainly in terms of listening and understanding all of us. But something I think you mentioned, and if I'm not wrong, Robin, was these websites or apps where you can be transcribed, your speech can be transcribed. Am I remembering this right correctly, Robin?
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be not a perfect alternative if you're in a monolingual environment, but it can be an option to try. If the computer has not understood the student and it's come up with the wrong transcription, again, they get this immediate feedback. Okay, maybe I have to reformulate and make this clearer. So that can sometimes be an alternative. But of course, nothing is perfect as yet in terms of transcribing human speech. So there's always
I started leaving messages on my phone, and then got these apps that will write the message, they transcribe it for you. And I thought there's huge potential here. And you're right, it's not going to be perfect, because sometimes the message that it would transcribe was just not what I'd said. And I'm going, oh, wow, I'm a native speaker, and I know, my pronunciation fine. So the app's the problem, but it will get better.
So interesting, right? Because you answered a lot. I was going to ask, and you guys have just given a really perfect answer, I think, about self-assessing, or students self-assessing their own pronunciation, and how adept have you found them to be at that? Because traditionally, as you told the story, Robin, about 8 out of 10 student is surprised. We're the teachers doing the assessing, and the student generally will just say, "Oh, thank you, that's great." But you also used the word empower earlier, and I think a self-assessment in multilingual settings, you gave a good example. In monolingual settings, how can we as teachers go about, or how have you found how effective, or at all, maybe not at all, are students at self-assessing their own pronunciation?
My experience was that they were tough on themselves. Hence the 7, 8, and 9 attempts before they got like, I don't have any more time, I've got to hand something in, I'll give them attempt number 6, it's the best I can do. I found my students excessively tough on themselves, and I needed to show them, ease up, you guys are good, you're doing a fine job. But they didn't have many opportunities to self-assess, and I was happy that they were working in groups and therefore getting peer feedback, because that's also incredibly powerful.
Have you seen them be able to measure their improvement?
Yes, because they're doing well. The system's evolved, and in the end, they would be doing 4 or 5 recordings during the year, and then they would go back and listen to the first recording and sometimes be massively embarrassed. Oh my God, did I hand that in? Hey, you did? Oh, it's terrible. Can't I do it again? No, you can't, because I've got to stop marking and go and have a life. But don't be embarrassed. It's fine. There's the mark. You got a 6, you got a 7, or whatever. The recording is really interesting because it can, and we mentioned this in the book, you can work into portfolios. Students would have a sequence of digital recordings of themselves that would go through the year. And if you wanted, you could hold one exercise or dialogue or monologue as constant, and through the year they'd have to do it again and again and again, and therefore they'd have a single dialogue with which they can refer back and see progress, plus other monologues and dialogues that they would do because they're pertinent to that particular moment in the year.
Right.
Okay.
But they could also, in their portfolio, bring in videos of people that they've heard who have the same mother tongue background, who are clearly successful in life, and who still sound Spanish, or still sound Turkish, or still sound Japanese. So they could build up a little sort of set of recordings of people they feel they could emulate. They could even make
another really wonderful.
Go on, Gemma.
Sorry, Robin, I was going to say, just another thing that we talked about and we've mentioned in the book as well, one of the most wonderful things about the recordings is it's private, it's a limited audience.
Yeah.
And that's something that is, again, it's very powerful, because you remove the fear factor, something that John Levis said about pronunciation. Pronunciation is the face of your speech. It's so easy to hear if you're different, if you stand out. And a lot of students are really shy and timid and worried, anxious about their pronunciation. And when they know it's only you that's going to be listening, or a chosen peer, you can just remove so much fear and anxiety that comes with pronunciation instruction and training. And I think it's one of the reasons why I like this technique so much.
It sounds like a diagnostic, let's say. So we're recording at the beginning, middle, and end, so they can notice, some differences. And before Leo dives into the impetus of you guys writing the book, We spoke with Donna Brinton, as Leo mentioned earlier, for the last episode of the podcast, and we had a webinar with her actually as well, and she kind of was talking about some of the flaws in a traditional, let's say, audiolingual based
Hmm.
speaking pronunciation diagnostic. Do you have, if a teacher's listening and they want to start to implement this in their classes, do you have a recommendation or a task of that original diagnostic of what could be with the concept of,
Well,
global English?
yeah, I mean, teachers have to become familiar with the content of the Lingua Franca Core, but
Right.
that's easy to access nowadays. And when we were writing the book for OUP, we added word stress because if you go right back to Jenny Jenkins' original work, she said there's not enough data to include it or exclude it. It's a gray area.
Hmm.
And we still don't know enough about word stress and its impact on intelligibility because some studies suggest it has none, and you can get the word stress wrong and be intelligible. And other studies say that lexical stress is actually important for intelligibility, even when it's international intelligibility. So, for lack of data, we have included it. So, that would be the Lingua Franca Core plus word stress. This is what teachers need to be able to check in their students.
So the
And
lingua
the
franca
teachers
core,
need to know this because
right?
then you can, once you know the elements of the Lingua Franca Core plus word stress, then you can listen to a recording a new student has given you and say, this student needs to work on this, 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 and this.
Right.
And word stress is often that kind of factor that really turns people off the lingua franca core. They're like, well, how? Because I think we've all seen, we've all had anecdotes in the classroom
Hmm.
where there's been a miscommunication because of incorrect word stress. And I think that for a lot of people, not having word stress in the lingua franca core, despite this very valid reason that Jennifer
Right.
Jenkins gave, we don't have conclusive evidence yet. That turns them off from the lingua franca core. Well, if it doesn't include word stress, clearly it's not accurate. But I think, like Robin said, it's been this kind of middle ground that when we add it in, people are more receptive to it. And also it's this great stepping stone to introduce nuclear stress, which is also part of the lingua franca core. So it can be this great introduction or first initial step into what this is.
And now,
Yeah.
since we're talking about the book, I kind of wanted to talk about the book, but I feel like we've covered a lot of the ground that is in the book. Yeah, right there. I want to ask you a few questions about the book. I think the first question I have to ask is why why did you decide to write a book on teaching English pronunciation for a global world? That's the first question. The second question is a more technical question because I'm very curious as to how people do things, like the process. I'm very much into the process. Like, how did you guys collaborate on this? Did you start with blank, empty pages, and then you were both like on a Zoom call, brainstorming ideas? I'm interested in the process of writing that book as well.
All right, I'm going to start with how the book originated. And it's very simple. I had been working with other experts in pronunciation on behalf of OUP. They wanted a common policy for all of their authors so that when an author of OUP works on pronunciation, they're working to a common ground. And that led into a position paper where OUP stated, and it's downloadable free from the
We're going to add that to the show notes.
website. So it led to the position paper, and I actually thought once we published the position paper that I could then retire. And no, OUP then said the position paper is an excellent statement, but with one or two addendum at the end with practical ideas, it's not practical. It's a statement of where pronunciation teaching is. We need a classroom resource book. Would you consider writing it? And that's where it started. I said yes, and then I panicked and said no, and then I said I will write it, but not on my own. I want to bring other people in because the pandemic's left me marginalized, and I'm feeling rusty, and I'm panicking. And they said, "Who do you want to bring in?" So I said, "Oh no, I know exactly who I want to bring in." Hello,
And the
Gemma.
rest is
How
yeah,
did we work together?
we kind of started talking about it at the IETFL conference in Belfast a couple of years ago. It was like the first face-to-face conference after COVID happened, and Robin, I think Robin had a very, very clear idea of exactly where we were going to go based on the position paper and Robin's handbook about teaching the pronunciation of English as a lingua franca. So he had a very clear vision, and we sat down and talked about it. We created a kind of table of contents of areas that we wanted to definitely include, and we created activities that were going to be included in each chapter, and then we went away and wrote them and exchanged chapters and gave feedback, and yeah, I mean, Robin, have I missed out anything?
No, it was. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What is one of the main reasons why a teacher should get a copy of this book? What's your pitch? What's your pitch for this book?
No, it's really simple. If you actually have thought about it and feel that you would be happier teaching your students towards intelligibility, and it just, you know, if you check all of the criteria of all of the major international exam boards, the way they judge pronunciation is intelligibility.
Huh. I did not know that.
There are none of them making references to native speaker accents. In all of them, the criteria for pronunciation are referenced to the speaker's intelligibility. Now I've gone and lost myself. What was I going to say?
It's a good pitch. If that's the pitch, that's a great pitch. That's the pitch.
Why should we buy the book?
But why should a teacher buy this book? Because if you think about it and read enough about it and decide, yes, I want my students above all to be intelligible, then you need a set of classroom activities that are coherent with that goal.
Mm-hmm.
And the trouble is, a lot of what is available, easily available, and especially available on the internet, if you go in and look for classroom ideas, is not about being intelligible. It's about sounding like a native speaker.
Right.
So this book is the simplest way of arming yourself with a huge number of activities that you can do that will help your students to become intelligible.
And I think as well, when I think about the book, I think, God, I wish I'd had this book 20 years ago, because the stuff that we talk about, you don't need to go away and prepare. There's stuff that, you know, it's techniques that you can bring into class spontaneously. You can integrate into your lesson with no preparation. You don't have to go and do anything to insert them. You can use the language that students are producing. You can use the language that comes from the activity that you're working on. And they're the kind of things that make pronunciation seem a far more simple and easy to integrate activity. And I just wish that something like that existed when I was starting out, because that was what was missing. So not only are we hitting the kind of intelligibility goal, but we're also giving very practical, easy to integrate techniques and activities, which I think is key, because something that I see all the time, or certainly hear all the time, is that teachers say to me, oh, I know I need to do pronunciation, but I just don't know where to start. And they'll start flicking through resource books. What should I do? Which activity should I do? Getting really overwhelmed because they don't know what to choose. So again, this just brings it back to the essentials, you know, techniques, rather than finding a material, finding a resource. It's techniques that can introduce.
We are very big on low resource teaching of pronunciation.
So are we. Nothing, no prep, no photocopying. It's just like, let's just, again, developing your, I think a lot of those things, from my understanding in the book, is that a lot of it is just develop teach agility with intelligibility, with teaching pronunciation. And I think teachers definitely need a tool belt. And I think this book will provide them with that. Which brings me to my last question, because we've been talking for, gosh, I don't know how long. It's been a long time. But this is good. This is good, because this is the kind of conversation that I wanted us to have. And I think everyone listening to this is also having a really good time. This is a question that I posted, and I expected teachers to send me a few questions we've posted on social media. And I went through a lot of the questions, and a lot of the questions we have already discussed. But there's one that I don't think we have talked about, and I think we've alluded to it, but we haven't really gotten into it, which is about the future of English pronunciation. How do you both see the future of English pronunciation evolving in the context of it being, as you use it in the book, a global language. Do you anticipate any sort of significant changes in how pronunciation is approached in language teaching, particularly concerning intelligibility and accent? I know I'm asking you to predict the future, but to the best of your knowledge, of course.
I'm not going to predict the future, but I hope that we become a great deal more tolerant of accent. And I suspect that's one thing. And another thing is I suspect that the vowel system of English will become simpler.
Yeah. We're
There's
already
just-
starting to see certain sounds, reducing in frequency.
Yeah. I mean, if English continues to be the dominant language of international communication, the pronunciation will be affected by the multiple L1 backgrounds of the users of English. And so many languages have simpler vowel systems than English that
True.
it seems to me inevitable that simplification will occur.
And I think as well, I mean, Jeff Lindsay, someone that talks about this a lot, who talks about how if we look at traditional course books, which still continue to have, if we take British English for an example, they still teach a quite archaic version of standard British English.
Right.
And when you compare that with how people who are today standard British English speakers, there's already this huge gap between what was even 50 years ago and what is today. In such a short time, there's been so much change and simplification, from diphthongs to
Right.
monophthongs and things like that. So I think it's a great example of what can happen in a short period of time. And that's only a native speaker accent. I think I agree with you, Robin, that with more international Englishes being spoken, I think that will certainly simplify.
Okay. I think this is a very good place for us to wrap this up, this very long and awaited conversation. I would like to thank Robin and Gemma, authors of Teaching English Pronunciation for a Global World. Is the book out already? I looked it up and I don't see it.
No, it's coming out February the 15th.
February 15th. So I think it's going to be a little bit after the podcast. So maybe the
Well,
podcast
we're
will
looking into
bump
the future now, so
details.
by the time
Yeah.
this is out, then it's probably out. So we'll have the link in the show notes, and everyone can go grab a copy.
Andrew, do you have that question or no?
I'm trying to find it because
Okay.
I forgot, and I'm looking at the transcript now. So give me a few minutes.
So
But
I'm
we can
gonna-
do the first part first. Robin, Gemma, we are trying a new thing, and we have a question for you, but I have to find it. But first, we're doing a thing where we ask a question to the people we're interviewing. So in this case, both of you. Any question for you to ask a question about anything teaching related, and we will ask the next person that we interview. And you don't know who that person is, you don't know what their expertise is, and you don't know anything about them. But what question do you have that you would like them to answer?
Yeah, the obvious question is, how do you feel about artificial intelligence? Is it the end of your career?
Good one. Good one.
Okay.
That's a very good one.
I am writing it down so we don't lose this one, Andrew.
That's a very good one. And I can't find the one from Laura. Laura was the one.
I guess we're gonna have to start here this time. And that's basically it. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Gemma. Thank you, Robin. Teaching pronunciation of English teaching English pronunciation for a global world. I was mixing up with Robin's old book. Book is going to be out in February. Make sure you get a copy of it. I think the pitch that they have delivered today was rather convincing. I'm definitely getting myself a copy of that. And thank you for listening, and we'll see you around.